Welcome to Adventures in Accessibility, a podcast that explores the far reaches of disability, access, and inclusion, with your host, Dana Barton.
Hi guys, welcome back to Adventures in Accessibility. Today's guest is Lydia XZ Brown. Lydia XZ Brown is an Asian American autistic disability rights activist, writer, and public speaker. The White House honored Lydia in 2013 as a champion of change, and in 2016 they were honored by the National Council on Independent Living with a National Advocacy Award. In 2018, they were awarded the Emerging Leader Award from the American Association for People with Disabilities. Lydia's advocacy work focuses on violence against multiply marginalized disabled people. They have worked to advance transformative change through writing, legislation, conducting anti-ableism workshops, and testifying at regulatory policy hearings. Currently, Lydia is the co-editor and visionary behind All the Weight of Our Dreams, an anthology of writings and artwork by autistic people of color. All right. Well, welcome, Lydia. We're so honored to have you join us today on Adventures in Accessibility. Lydia, I know that you're very accomplished. I've had the opportunity to review the honors and awards that you've been given, and I'm just really excited to learn more about you and also the work that you do. But first, I'm wondering if you'll start by sharing a little bit about your disability with us.
My background and where I come from is the autistic community as an autistic person. I also am multiply disabled, and I have other cognitive and psychosocial disabilities that affect the way that my brain works and functions. It thinks and learns, and generally how I react to things happening in the world around me.
Okay. When were you first diagnosed with having these disabilities?
I was first identified as disabled when I was in the 8th grade at 13 years old.
Okay. And so did you find that when you were diagnosed, and probably even before that, that you had accessibility challenges as a student?
I was very fortunate in that for the most part, I was excelling academically as a young person. And that changed around the time that I transitioned from high school to college. Unfortunately, that's fairly common for the subgroup of autistic people who go from high school to college, as of course people with all types of disabilities sometimes go to college, sometimes don't for a variety of reasons, some that are directly because of ableism, and others that may be because that particular person might not necessarily be interested in doing college type activities or be in a place where they're able to do college type learning. And for the group of us with my particular disability as autistic people who do go to college and do so right after high school, it's not an uncommon experience, certainly not universal, to begin to struggle at that point. So for me, it wasn't so much I became identified because I was struggling academically, but rather because my parents learned that there were other people out there my age who were autistic who had many similar experiences to me. And when they were talking to other parents, they realized that that sounded a lot like their child. And they thought that it might be worth exploring whether that would make sense.
Okay. You mentioned ableism. For listeners who might not be familiar with that term, how do you define ableism?
Ableism is a form of structural oppression that targets disabled people. And what that means is that in our society, there are a lot of different types of power. And frequently, entire groups of people hold power. That means political power, means social power, means economic power. It means being and treating as though you deserve more rights or more freedom. And oftentimes that power comes at the expense of an entire other group of people. And that creates oppression. And what that means in the context of disability is that people whose bodies and brains are more or less considered normal or healthy or sane have an enormous amount of power in society at the expense of people whose bodies and brains are considered broken or defective or deficient. So ableism is a name for what that oppression is and how it works. What it looks like is values that people hold, that only some kinds of people are valuable, that only some kinds of people are worth existing, that only some kinds of people are desirable, that only some kinds of people count as fully human. And on the flip side of that, other kinds of people are not valuable, are not worthy, or do not count as fully human. And that often comes down to things that we understand as disabilities. But ableism is also connected to other kinds of oppression. So ableism is often used as a way to oppress people who are low or no income. When folks say that if you are poor, it is because you are stupid or irresponsible, that's actually using ableist logic to justify oppression based on class. Or if people say that being Black or brown means that you are less intelligent than white people, then that is also using ableism and ableist logic in the oppression of Black and brown people. So ableism means how society structures itself to support and empower and enable some people while actively disempowering and targeting other people.
And where have you seen that in your life play out as it relates to your disability?
It's happened throughout my life in different ways, both large and small, whether it's been through being perceived as creepy and scary because I wrote fiction that dealt with topics of violence, something that led to me being falsely accused of planning a school shooting when I was still in high school, or whether it is, the study abroad person in my college insisting that the reason I should disclose my disability was because, and I quote her, well, when you walk into a room, people can just tell that you're different, that there's something off about you. You know, that kind of very ableist hyper visibilizing my disability, saying this is something that I'm going to treat as making you a freak, and say that not only is it something I draw attention to, but I'm going to draw a negative and harmful attention to and assume it is necessarily negative. Or whether it's small things like when I have conversations with other people and I mention that I'm disabled because it's relevant, it's come up in the conversation, I often get one of two responses, both of which are very ableist, but in different ways. One of those responses is, well, you don't seem disabled to me. It must be very mild. You seem totally normal. You're very articulate and smart. You're being very social. Why would you call yourself that? You're putting yourself down, like you're so accomplished. I don't think of you as disabled. No one would ever consider you that. You're just so talented. You know, that kind of ableism is basically that idea that if you're disabled, then you must be literally incapable of doing literally anything ever at any time. But then the other reaction I get, which is also ableist, but in a different direction, is people suddenly change how they were speaking to me when before they were speaking to me as a peer, someone that they thought of as a human, an adult, whatever. They suddenly switch their tone of voice and it suddenly becomes, oh, wow, good for you. Your family must be so proud of you. Your family probably had to help you a lot. You've overcome so much. And where are your family? Are you alone?
Wow.
The kind of ableism there is this assumption that if you are disabled, again, you must not be capable of understanding or communicating at all in any form, and we're going to talk to you like we think you're an infant, a newborn infant who does not understand language because they're 1 day old. And it's also harmful because on the one hand, people assume that if they believe or perceive you to be capable of anything or to have accomplished anything, then you can't count as disabled. But if you are struggling with anything, if you have a hard time with something, then they assume there is nothing that you can do, even if you can. And even if the type of support you need, you've clearly told people what it is, but they have refused to give it to you.
So given that individuals have treated you with this ableist attitude, when that happens, what is your natural reaction? How do you handle that situation?
It depends on the situation. When it's been someone who's in a position of power or authority over me, it can be difficult to challenge because you risk retaliation. And that's true for anybody, not just me. If you're in a situation where it's someone that you're choosing to keep in your life and you would like for them to stay in your life, they're your friend, they're a relative, they're a neighbor that you generally get along with, it can be harder to navigate for other reasons, because you should never have to accept somebody being virulently ableist to you. And yet people do it all the time, even and especially people who are close to us. And it can be hard to figure out the balance between deciding, when am I going to call attention to it and try to have a conversation? And what way am I going to do it? Because unfortunately, it's a reality that if we called it every single time it happened, we wouldn't have time to do or talk about anything else, because we would be constantly calling people on their ableism, literally every second. Like, we don't have time for that. We don't have energy for that. We call that spoons. We don't have spoons for that. And frankly,
Right.
it probably wouldn't help the relationship. And if the point is to try to save that relationship, to keep it, then that's not going to accomplish the goal. So there isn't a clear answer. But when people ask me, what can I do then if I'm in a situation where people are being ableist and I want to challenge it, my answer is, you have to yourself assess that situation. What is the relationship you currently have with the people or group that are being ableist? What kind of a relationship do you want or need to have going forward? And based on what you know of them, what kinds of approaches might be more likely to gain traction versus less likely to gain traction. And, in some situations, it may be that you need to be very direct. Perhaps you need to be very harsh. And perhaps you need to set a very clear boundary that you will not engage with that person if they persist in their ableism. And in other situations, it may be, I'm not going to bring it up unless and until we've gotten to a place where I know that they will be much more receptive to hearing and understanding what I have to say and share. And I'm going to do so in a much more gentle and gradual way, because I know based on this person that that's probably what's going to be more effective. And I can't tell anybody what that's going to be like. And I can't predict it in my life either, because it depends on what situation you're in and who that person or who that group is. It depends on how you know them. And it depends on how you want to continue to know them, if you do.
Sure. We do actually a lot of work here at the ADA Center on implicit bias. We're doing a 5-year study partnering with Project Implicit, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And so through that research that we're doing, I'm familiar with the theory of the spoons, but maybe our listeners aren't. Would you be willing to describe that for us?
Sure. Spoon theory was first written about by Christine Miserandino, who wrote about it in the context of being a chronically ill person, specifically living with lupus. And the spoon theory was a metaphor that she used when she was describing what it's like to live as a chronically ill, disabled person to a friend, which is that all kinds of activities and things that we do take up energy. And people who are not disabled or chronically ill in any way may have a certain amount of that energy available. But people who are disabled or chronically ill often have less available energy. And she gave the example of, let's imagine that our energy was in the form of spoons. And you've got 10 spoons to start out with in the morning. Well, taking a shower is 2 spoons. Eating is 3 spoons. Preparing food is 2 more spoons. And going outside to get groceries is going to be 5 spoons. Well, that number adds up to more than 10. So you only have 10 spoons for the day. And you have to pick which of those things you're going to do before you run out of spoons. And some days you might have more spoons. You might have more energy and ability to do things. And other days you might have fewer spoons because you've already been going through a stressful time. You didn't get enough sleep last night, or your body hurts too much today. And because our spoon counts fluctuate and are overall more limited on average than the amount of energy that people who are non-disabled have, it can be hard to figure out how to get through your day and how to navigate life knowing that you're on limited spoons. So a lot of disabled folks use spoons as a way of talking about that aspect of being disabled or chronically ill. And it's, with great thanks to Christine's essay, which has, gone around the world now many times, in being able to explain that and make it more understandable to people, disabled or not, who haven't necessarily had a chance to think about what it means to have less capacity sometimes.
So I know also that you're an attorney. Will you tell us how you decided to get involved with disability advocacy?
I've been doing disability advocacy, activism, and organizing for about 10 years, since I was about partway through high school. I became involved when I was connected in about 10th grade with the local chapter in Boston of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. I'd read some of their articles online, realized that not only were there autistic adults out there who were working together and meeting with each other, but they were doing so with an explicitly political mission. And that part of that mission was to advocate for societal understanding and approach to autism that seeks to accept us and support us rather than treat us as broken and needing to be fixed or cured.
Okay. And what's your journey been like with disability advocacy over the past 10 years?
I've moved in many ways. I've grown in many ways. I'm no longer doing my work primarily within or focused on the autistic community. That's for a variety of reasons. And I also have moved from doing rights-focused work to doing justice work. And the difference there is that rights-focused work emphasizes changing laws and policies to advance change and improve the position of disabled people in society. But justice work is far more expansive and deep and critical than that. Justice work recognizes that even if we pass the best laws, even if we pass laws that actually do an excellent job of what they're supposed to, and we improve those laws and we enforce those laws, you don't change people's minds and people's beliefs simply by changing laws. Laws can't do that. And even though we've passed some great laws, we passed the ADA in 1990, that was nearly 3 decades ago. We recognized the Supreme Court's decision in 1999 in the Olmstead case, that was 20 years ago. We passed the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, nearly 40 years ago, in the 1970s. Students with disabilities are still being segregated from school and criminalized. Disabled people in prisons are denied necessary accommodations to participate in hearings and activities that can determine their freedom, denied health care. Disabled people living in the community can't get into their own buildings, can't access the courts to fight against their landlords, can't access housing to begin with, can't access the homeless shelters. And disabled people throughout the United States, but particularly those of us who are at the margins of the margin, disabled people who are also queer or trans, disabled people who are negatively racialized, disabled people who are no and low income, disabled people who are immigrants or are faith minority, or belong to any number of intersecting and overlapping communities that are marginalized and targeted. We have never actually seen fulfillment of the promises in these laws, and yet they've been on the books for decades. So justice work, disability justice work, recognizes that what we have to do is radically transform our society, because if ableism is based in values about which kinds of people deserve to exist and which kinds of people don't, then we have to uproot those values and replace them with value systems that affirm that all people, no matter what their bodies or brains are like, what they look like, how they move, how they learn, how they perceive, that we all deserve to be here, that we all deserve to exist, that in fact, rights or freedom or justice can never be contingent on being able to contribute something or produce something or appear a certain way or communicate a certain way. There are no contingencies and no conditions. People are people. We all deserve freedom. We all deserve safety. We all deserve to be connected to communities of our choosing. We all deserve to be supported and receive care in ways that are responsive to our cultural backgrounds and our identities. And we all deserve to live in loving communities. And none of that can ever be optional. The law can't touch that.
You're spot on, and certainly speaking the language that we speak here at the ADA Center. Our focus is mainly on the Americans with Disabilities Act and the intent and spirit of that law and making sure that it's implemented correctly. But we do know that attitudinal barriers often prevent the ADA from being implemented and prevent people from understanding why these laws are in place in the first place. And going back to what you said about your work had been more rights focused and now it's more justice focused. Getting back to the rights focused side of things, when did you first learn about the ADA?
When I was a student in high school.
Okay. And why did you learn about it, or how did that education come to you?
I learned about it from other disabled activists in my community.
And what were the thoughts of people, those activists that you were communicating with, and your thoughts as you were learning about the ADA? How do people feel about the law?
I mean, it depends on who you're talking about and in what context. Many people have felt that the ADA has been transformative. It's been a landmark piece of legislation, and it has been. And also, it is never been enough. Even functioning from a rights-based focus, it's still never been enough. The ADA has not come with provisions that guarantee that it's actually monitored and enforced. And that's why everywhere you go, people are in violation of it. Employers, public accommodations, the government, schools, everybody routinely violates the ADA. And they violate the ADA in part because it doesn't actually carry enough weight to mean something.
I mean, that's essentially why I have a job, quite frankly. We operate a technical assistance center so that people can call and find out information. And it sometimes is surprising that 30 years later, we're still getting some very basic calls from people who just have no idea that the law exists or what it's here for. And that's super, super frustrating. Do you use the ADA in your current work? Or do you reference it, or what's that look like?
As an attorney, or just at all?
Just at all.
Yes, sometimes, yeah.
And how do you do that?
Sometimes the ADA is a useful tool in advocacy to remind people that the reason that you need to provide somebody with this accommodation is because the federal law says so, and you really don't want to be violating the federal law. Don't do it.
Fair enough. So you are an attorney. Are you practicing law currently?
Yes. I work at the Babylon Center for Mental Health Law. I represent students with disabilities in Maryland who are facing school push-out, disproportionate discipline, restraint, seclusion, and criminalization.
Okay. Can you tell us more about your specific work there? Are you able to talk about that at all?
Yeah, so I'm a Justice Catalyst Fellow. That means that I graduated from law school last year, and I developed a project, and my project is focused on advocacy with students in Maryland. And one of the goals of my project has been to support the students and the families that I've been working with in learning about and developing self-advocacy skills and connecting that to the broader disability rights movement.
Okay. And another project that you're working on is your anthology, or your co-editing of the anthology, The Weight of Our Dreams. What can you tell our listeners about that?
The anthology was published 2 years ago in summer 2017. The title is All the Weight of Our Dreams on Living Racialized Autism, and I was lead editor along with my co-editors Marenike Giwa-Onaiwu and Iash Kanazi. It was the first and still is the only anthology of art and writing that is entirely by autistic people of color and otherwise negatively racialized autistic people. There are 61 people whose work is featured in the anthology. You can learn about it at the website www.autismandrace.com. When you buy a copy of the anthology, either as an ebook or as a print copy, a portion of the proceeds goes toward the Fund for Community Reparations for Autistic People of Color's Interdependence, Survival, and Empowerment. I launched that fund a year ago in summer 2018 using proceeds from sales of the anthology and using an award that I'd received from another organization. And that fund gives out direct micro grants to individual autistic people of color as a form of mutual aid. And we've provided over $10,000 now in grants to several dozen people living all around the world to help them with everything from rent to water shutoffs, to court-imposed fines, to fees for summer camp, books for college, clothing, transportation to escape abusive situations, covering the cost of medication or of therapy, and about 1,000,001 other things. And If listeners are interested, you can make a donation to the fund by contacting the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network, AWN. The website is www.awnetwork.org. And if you make a donation to AWN, you can add a note that it is for the Autistic People of Color Fund. You can encourage libraries and schools to purchase copies of the anthology, which will also provide some donations to the fund. You can make a donation directly, but I'm very excited about that project, and I hope that those listening will be interested in supporting and learning more.
Yeah, and we'll definitely put those web addresses in our show notes too, so individuals can find them there. So Lydia, what does equal access look like for an autistic person?
It depends on the autistic person. None of us are identical, so some of us have different needs than others, and some of us have different capacities than others. But for many of us, we benefit from people being willing to be more explicit and direct with us, to take things in little pieces at a time, to try not to overwhelm us with sensory stimulation or information, and to give us opportunities to be able to make choices that make sense to us. So rather than saying, well, what would you like to do today? Saying, did you want to stay home or did you want to go out? If we want to go out, well, when you go out, did you have an activity you wanted to do? Or I know that you like doing these 3 things. You like going to the movies, walking in the mall, or sitting in the park. Did you want to do one of those or something else? Other things that can be helpful for many of us if we're indoors somewhere is helping manage the sensory stimuli that are there. Some autistic people need access to natural light, and other autistic people need there to be indoor light only, and other autistic people need it to be very dark. Depends on the autistic person.
Right.
You know, making those options available so that someone is able to reconfigure those settings so that they're better able to feel physically comfortable and safer helps a lot. Asking people up front, like, is there a temperature range that is more helpful? Is there something specific you'd like to be available to drink? Providing a schedule in advance, providing a list of other people. If there's people there, if it's a party or if it's a meeting, it's all very helpful. But really, none of these things are universal. And every autistic person might have a different reaction. There are autistic people who might hear the list of suggestions that I just gave and say, none of this applies to me. This is all irrelevant to me. And there's other autistic people who would hear the list that I just gave as some starting suggestions and say, yeah, that would help, but here's 20 other things you can do that are even more specific and supportive. Some people will have trouble communicating at all. And if someone's having trouble communicating, that's a two-way street. They're having trouble communicating and you're having trouble understanding. And so what you can do is do your best to try to problem solve. If the person is seeming to be less stressed out and more comfortable, you're probably on the right track. And if they seem more stressed, more tense, and more on edge, you're probably going down the wrong path and should maybe consider what you're doing. But, it's really hard to answer that. And that's not just for autism, but for any disability.
Absolutely.
It's difficult to say, here's this one thing that you can do versus, recognizing that for each of us, it's going to be different.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier, it kind of depends on the person. And every time we receive a call here, the answer is always, it depends. It depends on the situation. It depends on the disability, the person with the disability, et cetera. So I totally get that. In our line of work, I'm really curious to hear your answer to this question. We hear people talk all the time about people first language or person first language. Yet others are really focused on identity first language. So what's your perspective on this? And how can people like me feel confident in how we refer to people who relate to different communities?
There are histories behind both person first and identity first language. There are specific communities that strongly prefer person first and other specific communities that strongly prefer identity first. In other communities where there is no clearly stated community preference, although individual people may, of course, always have their own preferences. And even with a community that does have a general community preference, there are always people who don't agree with that community preference. My advice to other people in general is to learn the basics of where both come from.
Okay.
So first language comes from the history of the self-advocacy movement of people with intellectual disabilities, in naming that many people see them as not counting as people. They see a disability label of intellectual disability and treat that as the whole sum of who a person is, treat stereotypes, ableist stereotypes about that as the whole sum of who a person is, which has led to and continues to support widespread institutionalization and warehousing, the payment of sub-minimum wage, Section 14C, and sheltered workshops, the belief that people with intellectual disabilities should never live in a community, should never make choices for themselves, never fall in love or have a sexual partner, should never be allowed to make decisions about money or clothes or food, and who just need to be controlled. And that is deeply and profoundly violent. And so the People First movement, which is also the name of a movement, came out of people with intellectual disabilities asserting that actually it's important to understand that they count as people before anything else. And to see their humanity means to treat them first and foremost as a person before you get to the disability part. And that's where that comes from. Identity first language, on the other hand, comes from a political history of people who sometimes were treated horrifically solely on the basis of disability, but also oftentimes had disabled experience denied and erased, or were told, well, you can only talk about it if you minimize it and say, well, it's not really a part of me. And so identity first language came out of a sense of community power and collective pride. Who we are is okay. There's nothing wrong with being blind. There's nothing wrong with being autistic. Who we are is part of the fabric of humanity. We are also part of the definition of quote unquote normal human being. And so when you see me, if you don't see my disability, you're not actually recognizing my humanity, because I am defined by my disability just as I am defined by other aspects of my identity, personality, and experience that are important to making up who I am. And so both types of language have a history and have political power. And I tell people, if you're talking about disability in general, you should feel free to use both interchangeably. Use people with disabilities and disabled people, because you're recognizing and acknowledging both histories as important and powerful in disabled people's movements. And when you're talking about a specific community, you should do your best to use that community's preference if they have one and they've made it known. And if you're talking about a specific person, it's generally okay to expect that they're likely going to use that community preference. But if you have a chance, you should ask.
Yeah, that's great. That's a wonderful perspective. And I think that will enlighten a lot of our listeners, because I think sometimes there's confusion around how do I refer to a person with a disability. That's how a lot of questions that we get. So Lydia, to kind of wrap this up, I'm just wondering if you have a story or can share with us an adventure you had in gaining accessibility in some way within your life.
You asked me that, I remember.
Yeah.
And I was struggling to think of an example, because most of the time people ignore or refuse my access and accommodations requests.
Well, so that's an adventure in and of itself, I would imagine.
Wait, this is being recorded, isn't it?
I'm recording this, yes.
Let's talk about, I shouldn't talk about that one. They might, that could go badly. What about is it? No, that also could go badly.
You can leave names out of it.
Well, all these stories that I have that involve me, they all involve an entity, such as, for example, an employer or a school that denied access requests and flagrantly violated laws. And sometimes people are touchy about that.
Yeah. I mean, we hear that a lot. Could you give us an example of a type of accommodation request that you've asked for and has been denied?
Many times I benefit from access to cart captioning, especially if there is a conference call or if there's a training where there's one or two main presenters who will be speaking for a long time. And most of the time, people tend to deny that request from me because I'm not deaf or hard of hearing. The reason that I need part captioning is because of auditory processing disabilities, which means that while audiologically I am considered a hearing person, my brain doesn't always interpret speech the way that it's meant to be interpreted. And so someone is talking, but at a certain point, I'm hearing sounds and not language. So I need cart captioning. But a lot of folks don't know about that. They don't know that APD exists. They don't know how it affects somebody. And they don't believe that something like cart captioning is necessary, even though it would actually make the world infinitely more accessible.
Well, I know for myself, I find cart captioning super helpful, and I'm not hard of hearing either. But when I go to conferences or meetings, a lot of what I do, we have that captioning, and I find it very helpful for my concentration as well. So I fully support that notion that we should be able to get captioning. So when you've been denied that request, how have you handled it?
Depends on the situation. Sometimes I try to appeal it and argue about it. And sometimes I suck it up and either deal with it and as a result don't actually understand or participate as much, or I just don't bother. Well, I guess I'm not going.
Wow. All right. Well, I think that wraps up the questions that I have for you today, Lydia, but I'm wondering, how can our listeners get in touch with you? Are you on social media?
I am. You can follow me on Twitter at autistic Hoya. Hoya is spelled Hoya. You can also go to Facebook, and on Facebook, you can follow me at facebook.com/autistic Hoya. Same name. I also have Instagram, technically, which is hilarious, and you're welcome to follow it. But you probably won't get what you're looking for.
And tell us why that is.
You'll see.
Okay, I love it. That's awesome. All right, Lydia. Well, that's all the time we have today for Adventures in Accessibility. Again, I just really appreciate your time and your perspective, and it was great chatting with you this afternoon.
You too. And I'm really glad I was able to help. And I hope that, we have a chance to connect in the future. And again, for listeners who want to support, there are many ways that you can do that, and there will be links in the notes.
Perfect. Thanks, Lydia.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Adventures in Accessibility. Tune in next time for another dive into the unknown.
Adventures in Accessibility is hosted by Dana Barton, produced by Emily Schumann, and Mike Shea is our sound engineer. This podcast is a project of the Rocky Mountain ADA Center and is funded under a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. Grant number 90DP0094-01-00. This production is intended solely for entertainment and informal guidance and should not be considered legal advice. The opinions expressed by guests are not necessarily held or endorsed by the Rocky Mountain ADA Center.